June 6, 1944. The waters off Normandy churned red as American soldiers waded through a hell they had never imagined possible. Within the first hour at Omaha Beach, over 2,000 men fell, and those who survived quickly learned a terrifying truth. The Wehrmacht was unlike any enemy they had trained to face. Sergeant James Donnelly from the 29th Infantry Division pressed his body against the sand as machine gun fire tore through the air above him. He had fought in North Africa against German forces, but nothing prepared him for this. The German defensive positions were mathematically precise, overlapping fields of fire that left no dead zones, no safe passage. Every bunker supported another, every trench connected to a network of reinforced positions. This was not merely an army defending a beach. This was a war machine that had perfected the art of killing. The young soldiers from Iowa and Texas, who had boasted about quickly defeating the Germans, now understood why their officers had been so grim during briefings. The Wehrmacht had been fighting for 5 years by then, evolving through brutal campaigns in Poland, France, the Soviet Union, and North Africa. They were not conscripts playing soldier. They were professionals who had survived the most intense warfare the world had ever seen. As Donnelly finally pushed forward past the seawall, he witnessed something that would haunt him for decades. A single German MG-42 machine gun position held up an entire company of American soldiers for 3 hours. The weapon's rate of fire was so high that it sounded like cloth tearing rather than individual shots. Americans had trained with the slower Browning machine guns and were unprepared for the psychological impact of such devastating firepower. According to military historian Stephen Ambrose's comprehensive study in Citizen Soldiers, American forces consistently reported that German defensive tactics were far superior to anything Allied planners had anticipated. The German soldier operating that MG-40-2 was not a fanatic or a superhuman warrior from propaganda films. He was simply a well-trained professional who understood his weapon, his position, and his mission. When American forces finally flanked the position hours later, they found the gunner had been wounded twice but continued firing until physically unable to do so. This level of determination, combined with superior tactical doctrine, created an enemy that demanded the highest respect from those who faced them. By nightfall on D-Day, American commanders were revising everything they thought they knew about the German military. The optimistic predictions of a quick advance inland evaporated as German panzer divisions, moving only at night to avoid Allied aircraft, began organizing devastating counterattacks. Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder, who led the Ranger assault on Pointe du Hoc, stated in his after-action report that German resistance exceeded worst-case scenario planning by a factor of 3. The soldiers who survived that first day in France understood something their families back home could not. This war would not be won by enthusiasm or industrial might alone. The German army represented the culmination of centuries of Prussian military tradition combined, with modern technology and tactical innovation. They were fighting on ground they had prepared for years, led by officers who had survived the brutal Eastern Front, and equipped with weapons designed through hard-earned battlefield experience. January 20th, 1943. While Americans were still coming to terms with their defeat at Kasserine Pass in North Africa, the German Sixth Army was being annihilated at Stalingrad. This crushing defeat would paradoxically create the most dangerous version of the Wehrmacht that American soldiers would later face in Western Europe. The Soviet-German conflict was warfare on a scale that dwarfed everything else in human history. Entire army groups disappeared in weeks. The German military either adapted or died, and those who survived brought back knowledge that no military academy could teach. They learned how to fight outnumbered 10-1, how to extract maximum casualties from every defensive position, and how to make retreats as deadly as advances. August Heinrich Kaufmann, a regimental commander who fought from Moscow to Berlin, kept detailed journals that were later recovered by American forces. His writings revealed the transformation of the Wehrmacht through suffering. He described how officers who relied on peacetime tactics were dead within weeks on the Eastern Front, replaced by men who understood that survival meant embracing brutal pragmatism. Kaufmann wrote that by 1943, every German company commander had personally witnessed the destruction of multiple divisions and had learned to fight with whatever resources remained. This crucible created a military culture focused obsessively on tactical excellence at the small unit level. German squads were built around the MG-42 machine gun, with every other soldier's role defined by supporting that weapon. In contrast, American squads dispersed firepower among all members more evenly, which looked democratic on paper but proved less effective in practice. The German system meant that even undermanned, undersupplied units could inflict disproportionate casualties if positioned correctly. When Major Richard Winters of the 101st Airborne Division encountered German paratroopers in Normandy, he found himself facing soldiers who had survived Crete, the Eastern Front, and Italy. These were not garrison troops or reluctant conscripts. Winters, who would later be portrayed in the series Band of Brothers, noted in his memoirs that German paratroopers were the finest soldiers he encountered. During the entire war, combining Allied-level equipment with superior tactical training and years of combat experience. The German Army's ability to conduct mobile defense was particularly deadly. Rather than holding every position to the last man as propaganda suggested, German commanders excelled at tactical withdrawals that drew Allied forces into carefully prepared killing zones. Reference materials from the United States Army War College archives document how panzer divisions would appear to retreat, only to counterattack from an unexpected angle once American forces had overextended their supply lines. Soviet military innovations also pushed German tactical development forward. The Red Army's use of mass artillery, deep battle doctrine, and ruthless exploitation of breakthroughs forced the Wehrmacht to develop sophisticated defensive techniques. By the time American forces landed in France, they were facing an army that had learned these lessons through the deaths of millions on the Eastern Front. The Germans knew exactly how to channel enemy advances into prepared killing zones, how to use reverse-slope defenses to negate artillery superiority, and how to time counterattacks for maximum psychological impact. Captain Belton Cooper, a maintenance officer with the 3rd Armored Division, later wrote extensively about the technological and tactical gulf between American and German armored forces. His book, Death Traps, described how American Sherman tanks were systematically outmatched by German Panthers and Tigers, but more importantly, how German tank commanders positioned their vehicles with professional expertise that American crews, despite their courage, could not match in their first months of combat. August 7, 1944. The breakout from Normandy had begun, and American forces were finally advancing rapidly through France. Victory seemed close at hand, but Lieutenant Robert Edlin of the 2nd Infantry Division knew better. He had just survived the Battle of Mortain, where a German counterattack nearly cut off the American advance despite overwhelming Allied superiority in numbers and air support. The German operational doctrine, refined over decades and perfected through warfare, gave even depleted units shocking combat effectiveness. While American forces relied heavily on centralized command and control, German doctrine emphasized mission-type tactics called off-track tactic. Officers received objectives rather than detailed orders, allowing them to adapt to rapidly changing battlefield conditions. This flexibility meant that German units could respond to unexpected situations faster than American forces, who often needed to wait for orders from higher command. At the squad and platoon level, this difference became life or death. When an American patrol encountered unexpected resistance, standard procedure involved reporting up the chain of command and waiting for orders. A German patrol leader in the same situation had the authority and training to immediately call for support, maneuver his squad, or withdraw as the situation demanded. This seemingly small difference in military culture accumulated across thousands of engagements, giving German forces a consistent tactical advantage. The Germans also demonstrated superior understanding of combined arms warfare at tactical levels. While American doctrine emphasized coordinated operations between infantry, armor, and artillery at divisional and regimental levels, German doctrine pushed this integration down to company and even platoon level. A German infantry company might have organic artillery observers, engineers, and anti-tank specialists who regularly trained and fought together. American companies were more homogeneous, requiring coordination with separate specialist units that they might never have worked with before. Sergeant Curtis Cullen, who famously invented the hedgerow cutter that allowed American tanks to break through Normandy's bocage country, later reflected on why such innovations were necessary. The Germans had been fighting in similar terrain on the Eastern Front and had already developed tactics to exploit enclosed terrain. They positioned their forces to channel armor into kill zones, used infantry to isolate supporting elements, and maintained multiple fallback positions so that breaking through one defensive line simply led to another. American forces, despite material superiority, were learning these lessons through costly trial and error. The quality of German non-commissioned officers particularly impressed American veterans. While American sergeants were often promoted from within units based on time in service or because they survived when others did not, German NCOs attended specialized schools and were considered the backbone of tactical execution. A German squad leader might have years of combat experience and formal training equivalent to an American lieutenant. This meant that German units maintained combat effectiveness even when officer casualties ran high. Artillery coordination provided another stark contrast. The Germans had developed sophisticated techniques for quickly concentrating artillery, fire from multiple batteries onto emerging threats. American forces often struggled to bring artillery support to bear quickly, hampered by longer communication chains and less flexible doctrine. At the Battle of Hürtgen Forest, German artillery demonstrated the ability to mass fires within minutes of identifying American concentrations, while American counter-battery fire took significantly longer to organize. Perhaps most frustratingly for American soldiers, the Germans seemed to need less of everything to accomplish the same results. A German company at half strength could often hold a position that required a full-strength American company to assault. This efficiency came from years of fighting with limited resources, where survival meant extracting maximum effectiveness from every man and weapon. American industrial might eventually overwhelm this expertise, but the human cost was far higher than planners had anticipated. December 16, 1944. The Ardennes forest erupted with the thunder of German artillery as 3 German armies smashed into lightly defended American lines. The Battle of the Bulge would become the costliest battle in American military history, and would demonstrate why veterans considered the Wehrmacht so dangerous even in its death throes. The German offensive caught American forces completely by surprise, despite having achieved nothing comparable since 1940. This shock alone demonstrated the Wehrmacht's continued capability to plan and execute complex operations. Over 200,000 German soldiers, hundreds of tanks, and thousands of artillery pieces had assembled in secret, then struck with devastating precision. The initial assault shattered 2 American divisions and created panic throughout the Allied command structure. Private Kurt Vonnegut, who would later become a famous author, was captured during the initial German breakthrough. He witnessed firsthand the professional competence of German soldiers even as their nation crumbled. In his semi-autobiographical novel, Slaughterhouse-Five, he described German soldiers who were hungry, exhausted, and knew the war was lost, yet continued to fight with disturbing effectiveness. This was not fanaticism but professional military culture that persisted regardless of strategic circumstances. The German spearheads advanced 60 miles in some sectors before American reinforcements could seal the breakthrough. This operational mobility, achieved in winter conditions against an enemy with total air superiority once weather cleared, showcased capabilities that few other militaries possessed. German commanders demonstrated sophisticated understanding of logistics, timing and exploitation that kept American forces off balance for weeks. At Bastogne, surrounded American forces discovered that German siege tactics were as professional as their assault capabilities. Rather than launching wasteful frontal attacks, German forces systematically isolated the town, interdicted supply routes, and applied pressure at weak points. Only the desperate aerial resupply effort and Patton's rapid relief column prevented the garrison's destruction. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe's famous reply of "nuts" to German surrender demands has become legendary, but his after-action report soberly assessed German siege operations as professionally executed and nearly successful. The Battle of the Bulge also highlighted German adaptability at unit level. When fuel shortages stranded tank columns, crews dismounted and fought as infantry. When communication systems failed, units continued operations based on their understanding of commander intent rather than awaiting new orders. This resilience in chaos was the product of military culture and training that emphasized individual initiative within operational frameworks. American soldiers also encountered the full spectrum of German military capability during the Ardennes offensive. Elite SS panzer divisions fought alongside hastily raised Volksgrenadier units and remnants of regular army divisions. Even the lower-quality units demonstrated better tactical proficiency than American intelligence had predicted. This depth of competence across the German military structure even laid in. The war surprised Allied commanders who had assumed that only elite units remained effective. The weather conditions favored defenders and should have negated German advantages, yet they adapted. German soldiers were equipped and trained for winter warfare through Eastern Front experience. They understood how to maintain weapons in freezing conditions, how to move through snow without exhausting troops, and how to exploit limited visibility. American forces, many experiencing their first winter combat, struggled with frozen weapons, trench foot, and the psychological toll of fighting in brutal cold. By January 1945, the bulge had been eliminated and German forces pushed back to their starting positions. The offensive had failed strategically but succeeded in demonstrating that a dying lion remained deadly. American casualties exceeded 80,000, with nearly 20,000 killed. For soldiers who survived, the respect for German military capability was no longer theoretical but earned through the hardest possible experience. March 7, 1945. American forces captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen intact, providing a crucial crossing over the Rhine River. This lucky break should have signaled the final collapse of German resistance, yet the fighting that followed demonstrated why American veterans never underestimated their opponent regardless of circumstances. The German Army's transformation into a fortress defense force showcased adaptation under impossible conditions. With mobility lost due to fuel shortages and air supremacy impossible to contest, German commanders reverted to sophisticated urban defense tactics. Every city became a killing ground designed to extract maximum casualties from Allied forces, even when the strategic situation was hopeless. At Aachen, the first German city captured by American forces, Colonel Gerhard Wilk commanded the defense with mathematical precision. His 3,500 troops, many of them overage reservists and young conscripts, held out for 19 days against 19,000 American soldiers, supported by massive artillery and air power. The battle consumed 5 American divisions and inflicted over 5,000 casualties. When Wilk finally surrendered on October 21, 1944, he had held far longer than any military planner thought possible. The defense of Aachen became a template replicated across Germany. Buildings were prepared as strongpoints with interlocking fields of fire. Rubble from Allied bombing was incorporated into defenses, creating obstacles that channeled attackers into predetermined killing zones. Underground utilities became movement corridors, allowing defenders to appear unexpectedly behind American lines. Even when surrounded and cut off, German strongpoints continued fighting, requiring systematic destruction that slowed American advances to a crawl. Urban combat negated many American advantages. Tanks, so effective in open country, became vulnerable targets in city streets. Artillery and air power could destroy buildings but often made rubble that favored defenders. The massive firepower that overwhelmed German forces in France proved less decisive in close quarters fighting, where a single soldier with a Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon could destroy a Sherman tank from a cellar window. Sergeant Henry Giles of the 28th Infantry Division fought through multiple German cities and described the experience as worse than anything he faced in France. In cities, the front line was everywhere and nowhere. German soldiers might be above, below, or behind American positions simultaneously. Every window was a potential sniper position, every doorway a potential ambush. The psychological strain of urban combat, combined with high casualties, broke units that had performed well in conventional operations. The Hitler Youth and Volkssturm militia, often dismissed as ineffective, proved surprisingly dangerous in urban environments under professional Wehrmacht leadership. These forces lacked training and equipment for mobile warfare but could hold fortified positions under supervision of experienced NCOs. At Heilbronn, teenage boys and old men held the city for over a month, inflicting 3,000 casualties on American forces. Their fanatical determination, guided by professional tactical expertise, created a nightmare for attacking forces. German employment of anti-tank weapons in urban settings was particularly effective. The Panzerfaust, a simple disposable rocket launcher, allowed even untrained troops to destroy tanks at close range. Positioned in rubble with overlapping coverage, these weapons devastated American armor. After-action reports from First Army operations in Germany noted that tank losses per mile advanced were significantly higher in urban terrain than in any previous operations, directly attributable to German anti-tank tactics. The Rhine River crossings demonstrated German engineering expertise applied to defensive operations. Despite having months to prepare demolitions, German engineers destroyed bridges only at the last possible moment, maximizing their utility for military operations. When bridges fell, German forces immediately established defensive positions to contest river crossings. American engineers had to work under fire while German observers called accurate artillery strikes on crossing sites. The Rhine became a barrier that cost thousands of additional casualties despite Allied material superiority. April 11, 1945. American and Soviet forces were racing toward Berlin from opposite directions, and Germany's defeat was mathematically certain. Yet the Wehrmacht continued fighting with professionalism that amazed even hardened veterans. This final phase revealed the true depth of German military culture. Lieutenant Jack Hallowell of the 83rd Infantry Division encountered German paratroopers defending a bridge in central Germany. These men knew the war was over, knew their families were likely dead or displaced, yet executed a textbook defense that cost American forces an entire day and heavy casualties. When finally overrun, the survivors requested permission to recover their dead before being taken prisoner. This maintenance of military discipline and unit cohesion in absolute defeat impressed American soldiers far more than propaganda about superhuman German warriors. The German General Staff System, dating back to the 19th century reforms of Gerhard von Scharnhorst and Helmuth von Moltke the Elder, had created institutional military excellence that persisted regardless of political leadership or strategic circumstances. German officers were trained to think operationally, understanding warfare as an interconnected system rather than a series of disconnected battles. This education produced commanders who could optimize performance even with limited resources. Major Richard Winters observed that the quality of German junior officers remained high throughout the war. While American platoon leaders were often college students with 90 days of training, German lieutenants typically had years of military education and service. This investment in officer development meant that tactical decisions were consistently better executed by German forces. Even improvised battle groups assembled from remnants of destroyed units often fought more effectively than intact American companies simply because their leadership was superior. The German medical services also demonstrated organizational competence that American soldiers respected. Despite collapsing infrastructure and overwhelming casualties, German medical personnel maintained triage systems and treatment protocols. American medics liberating concentration camp survivors often found that Wehrmacht field hospitals nearby were still functioning with professional standards, even as the regime they served committed unprecedented atrocities. This dichotomy was deeply troubling to American veterans. How could such professional soldiers serve such evil purposes? Combat engineers were another German specialty that impressed American observers. German pioneers could construct defensive positions of remarkable sophistication with minimal materials and time. They understood how to use terrain, create obstacles, and integrate natural features into defense networks. The Siegfried Line, while incomplete and poorly manned, showcased German engineering philosophy applied to fortifications. Where properly defended, these positions required massive resources to overcome despite being constructed years earlier. Supply and logistics, often considered an American strength, showed German efficiency even in defeat. The Wehrmacht had learned through years of operating with inadequate logistics how to husband resources and maintain operations on minimal supply. German divisions late in the war required far fewer tons of supplies per day than equivalent American formations, through a combination of lower motorization, efficient distribution, and ruthless prioritization. This meant that even surrounded German units could often fight longer than American planners expected. The integration of combined arms at tactical levels remained a German advantage throughout the war. A German infantry battalion might include organic anti-tank guns, anti-aircraft weapons, engineers, and artillery observers who trained together constantly. American battalions had to coordinate with separate supporting units, creating communication delays and coordination problems. German forces exploited these seams repeatedly, isolating supporting elements and defeating American units in detail. Military intelligence was another area where German professionalism shone despite strategic failures. Wehrmacht intelligence officers correctly assessed Allied capabilities, predicted offensive timing, and identified operational objectives with remarkable accuracy. German failures were strategic and political, not tactical or operational. The army itself functioned with competence that far exceeded the rotting regime it served. May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally, and American soldiers could finally rest. Over 100,000 Americans had died in Europe, hundreds of thousands more wounded. As veterans processed their experiences, a consensus emerged. The German army had been the most dangerous enemy not because of ideology or equipment, but because of military culture and professional excellence. After-action reports from every American division that fought in Europe consistently praised German tactical proficiency while criticizing Allied preparation. The United States Army had entered the war with doctrine emphasizing firepower and mobility, but underestimating the importance of tactical expertise. German forces repeatedly demonstrated that well-trained, well-led troops could overcome material disadvantages through superior tactics. The systematic study of German military effectiveness became a priority for the United States Army immediately after the war. Officers like Colonel Trevor Dupuy spent decades analyzing combat engagement data, creating mathematical models to quantify military effectiveness. His research, published in works like A Genius for War, concluded that German ground forces were approximately 20 to 30% more effective than American forces in equivalent circumstances. This advantage persisted across the entire war, from the first engagements in North Africa to the final battles in Germany. American military education was reformed based on lessons learned fighting the Wehrmacht. The Command and General Staff College incorporated German tactical case studies. The emphasis on mission-type orders and decentralized execution became standard in American doctrine, directly copied from the German system. The modern American military's focus on small unit leadership and NCO development traces directly to recognition that German emphasis on this produced superior battlefield results. Weapons development also reflected lessons learned. The United States abandoned the ineffective Sherman tank design in favor of heavier, more powerful vehicles. American machine gun doctrine changed to emphasize sustained fire from fixed positions, mirroring German M42 employment. Infantry squad organization was revised to concentrate firepower around automatic weapons rather than distributing it evenly. These were acknowledgments that German weapons design and employment doctrine had proven superior in combat. The psychological dimension of facing the Wehrmacht left permanent marks on American veterans. Soldiers who fought in the Pacific Theater often described Japanese forces as fanatic and suicidal, but fighting the Germans produced different memories. German soldiers were professionals who could be respected even as enemies. This recognition that efficiency and military virtue could exist separate from moral virtue troubled many veterans for the rest of their lives. Post-war interrogations of German officers provided insights that shaped Cold War military planning. American strategists recognized that if the Soviet Union adopted German tactical doctrine while maintaining their massive, numerical advantage, NATO forces would face an almost impossible defense problem. This drove American emphasis on nuclear weapons and later precision-guided munitions as force multipliers, necessary to offset potential tactical disadvantages against Soviet forces trained in German methods. Veterans' memoirs and oral histories consistently emphasize respect for German military capability. Stephen Ambrose, interviewing hundreds of veterans for his books, noted that soldiers who fought in Europe almost universally acknowledged German tactical superiority. This was not admiration for Nazism. Veterans expressed hatred for the Nazi regime but recognition of professional military excellence. The distinction was important to many veterans who wanted to honor fallen comrades while acknowledging the competence of their opponents. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted immediately after the war, revealed that despite overwhelming industrial and material advantages, Allied forces had needed nearly a year to defeat Germany after D-Day. Planners had optimistically predicted victory within months, but German military effectiveness stretched the campaign far longer. The survey concluded that German tactical proficiency at Army Group, Corps, Division, and battalion levels had consistently exceeded Allied capabilities, compensating for strategic failures and resource shortages. The German military effectiveness in World War II stemmed from institutional culture developed over centuries. The Prussian military reforms of the early 19th century created a general staff system that professionalized warfare. Officers were selected by competitive examination, educated in military theory and history, and trained to think operationally. This system survived imperial collapse, the Versailles restrictions, and even Nazification, producing military professionals regardless of political circumstances. The emphasis on Auftragstaktik, tactic, giving subordinates objectives rather than detailed orders, created organizational flexibility that Allied forces struggled to match. This